If you are deconstructing your Christian faith, one of the first things you might start to question is whether or not God exists. I have a video on 3 questions I think you should investigate first on your journey, and I would invite you to check that out. I cover the first question of the nature of truth with my friend David Pallmann in this video here, which is a great conversation. Now, I want to cover the process that I went through to deepen my answer to the question, does God exist? Hello, doubters. If you are doubting your Christian faith, you are in the right place. I too have gone on the journey of picking apart and doubting Christianity just like you. If you are on this journey, I hope to walk with you as I did over the last few years. I have reconstructed my Christianity, and this channel hits on some of the pieces of that journey. I would encourage you to like this video, subscribe if you are on a similar journey, and hit the notification bell. Now, I will not spend this video laying out all of the reasons I think God exists, although I will touch on some of them. But I hope to focus more on the process, some of the building blocks that I think are important to answer this question, and where others might disagree. Think about the beginning of your Christian journey. Maybe you can trace it back to a prayer at youth group, a retreat where you swore you encountered God for the first time, a concert or worship night, or maybe you didn't really know the exact event. For some of you, you might not be able to remember a time when you weren't Christian. But at some point, something triggered a change. You started to question whether or not this whole thing adds up. Maybe you looked back at that experience and realized it could have been something other than God. Well, please consider this. Perhaps God was using the song, your surroundings, the smell, the friends, the chemicals in your brain, or whatever to draw you to Him. Just because there are additional explanations, you don't have to throw out the ultimate explanation and the one that was most real and most obvious to you at the time. Merely giving additional explanations for what was going on shouldn't eliminate the fact that God was involved. I know some of you watching will say that this is wishful thinking or claim that because this isn't repeatable, it fails as a valid explanation. But to those, I would say we can and should be able to give other reasons as well. For me, I did have an experience that was more real than anything else I have experienced. But when that feeling started to wane, when it was crowded out by questions and became a distant memory, I began to dig deeper into the question of God's existence. Again, what I found was profound. There are thousands of amazing videos that give the evidence for God's existence in a much better, more well thought out way than I ever could. I do not want to repeat that evidence here, but I do want to take you on my journey. Now, one of the most compelling reasons I found to believe there is a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and personal being was an argument called the Kalam cosmological argument, put forth by a Christian philosopher named William Lane Craig. He wasn't the first one to make this argument. It is over 1,000 years old, and others have argued it as well, but he might be the most well-known. Can you find holes in this argument? Sure, but I think in doing so, you give up some other fairly essential pieces of reality. In my view, the cost is just too high. Now, if you aren't familiar with the argument, it goes something like this. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. I think this argument is so compelling because it fits with our everyday experience of reality and it has scientific data that supports it. Now, again, you might disagree. Now, others have disagreed, and I want to point out 2 often cited reasons for rejecting this argument. Then I want to explain why I can't follow suit. I want to play a clip from a conversation that Craig and YouTuber Cosmic Skeptic had. The objection that Cosmic Skeptic raises is that the only example of something beginning to exist would be the universe, and so premise 1 is not very well supported. Cosmic Skeptic denies that you being born is an example of you beginning to exist because you are just a rearrangement of pre-existing stuff. Let's check out the clip.
Hit on our disagreement then, which seems to be that you would say that we call a Homo sapien a new object that begins to exist, a new thing, because it begins to exist. Whereas I would say that conceptually it begins to exist because we've decided to call it Homo sapiens. It's kind of the reverse,
Yeah.
right? I think that's the disagreement we're having.
Yeah, well, this gets into this question again that I mentioned, whether or not you think there are really composite objects or not. And however you come down on that, there are going to be certain entities that are not composite objects, like fundamental particles, like electrons and quarks and so forth. And I would say persons, like yourself. And these provide clear-cut examples of things that exist that are not just arrangements of prior matter, and therefore don't have any objective reality.
Well, okay, so the reason why I wanted to make this argument is to try and get across the point that I feel that the only thing that, if anything, has meaningfully begun to exist, the only thing that would fulfill that criterion would be the universe itself, because everything within the universe that begins to exist in a conceptual sense only, is the argument that I was trying to make. But clearly you disagree with that.
Yes, right.
I suppose...
And I think, I mean, you're talking here about a view that is, and I hate to get technical, it's called mereological nihilism.
Yeah,
that is to
yes.
say that there are no composite objects.
Essentially, yes.
But even mereological nihilists recognize that there are fundamental particles that are not composites. They're not aggregates of things. And some, like Peter van Inwagen, would say that living things, like horses and humans and persons, are also not just aggregates of material, because they are alive and therefore have a kind of unity to their being that goes beyond being merely an aggregate of material things. So I think the person who's going to take the line of mereological nihilism, well, it's worse than mereological nihilism. I mean, he has to say that there are no fundamental objects.
Well, I'm not sure that's the case. For instance, if we accept that fundamental particles exist, and what we mean by fundamental particles are simply things that can't be broken down any further. And so what we mean when we say beginning to exist is a rearrangement of fundamental particles in such a way that it kind of that it gives rise to arbitrary labeling as a new object, right? So that's the kind of view that I would take. Not that there aren't composite things, but that everything that begins to exist is just an arrangement of composite things.
All right, that's not you mean arrangement of fundamental things?
Yes. Well, if you break it down far enough, yes.
Symbols. Right. Yes, okay, and that would be a consistent view. It's a very radical view, one that I wouldn't hold. I can't see any good reason to be a mereological nihilist. But in any case, I don't think that would subvert the argument for the universe beginning to exist.
Right.
Because in that case, you can rephrase the argument, not such that the universe began to exist, but you can say all fundamental particles began to exist.
Sure, but then do you see how that just completely undermines the idea of the common sense experience of things beginning to exist? Because although it may make philosophical sense to talk about fundamental particles beginning to exist, we wouldn't be able to say something like we've observed it happening.
Oh, no, I think that's not right, Alex. What it requires is a modification of the second premise, not the first. The first premise, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, would remain intact. It's just that on the mereological nihilist view, very, very few things begin to exist because they don't exist. There are no people, there are no horses, there are no skyscrapers, there are no chairs. Well, but if you reformulate the second premise so that it states not the universe began to exist, but all the fundamental particles began to exist, you get the same conclusion.
What has to be given up is the realness of chairs, horses, and you and I. Now, this is a high price tag to deny premise one of this argument. The way that Alex holds the opposite view, that he would switch around what something is because we have labeled it in such a way. I, like Craig, would hold the view that you and I do exist, and that isn't the case merely because humans have labeled the stuff that makes you up, you. I would highly recommend watching the whole dialogue. It is eye-opening and mind-stretching. Part of my journey is I realized that the other things, the obvious things that I would have to deny if I rejected something like the Kalam cosmological argument. I want to stress this argument isn't the only reason I believe that God exists, but I want to stress with the previous example and the following example of the price tag for adopting some of these objections. Let's turn to this next clip with Scott Clifton.
Sure.
To begin, do you think that the causal premise of the argument is false or simply that it's unproven?
I think that it's false. I
Really?
think that, yeah, I think that it's false because, well, so when I think about causality, you know, when I kind of do an armchair analysis of what causality is, it appears to have all these features, right? It appears to be a temporal and spatial process. It appears to take place by an interaction of an efficient cause with a material cause within time and space. I think something begins to exist only if there was a point in time before it existed, where it didn't exist yet, right? There's all these features of causality as we observe it in the empirical world that I think can't be exported to something like the universe, which is defined as the totality of material reality.
Okay, well now wait though. That would not necessarily mean that the causal premise is false. I mean, that's not a proof of its falsehood. You don't think, do you, that things can just pop into existence uncaused?
No, certainly not. So I don't think that within the space-time universe, I think that, so here, I guess what I would say here is that I think that the scope of the causal principle is physical and not metaphysical, right?
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I think once you get to something like the totality of time and space itself, the causal principle breaks down, and I don't think we have good enough reasons for thinking it would apply to the universe itself.
Right. Okay. Now that's quite different. That's not an attack so much on the idea that something that begins to exist as a causes the scope of the principle, that you don't want to allow it to apply to the universe itself. Now, there, I think one would want to hear what good reasons would disqualify the universe from lying within the scope of this principle. What is it about the universe that would allow it to come into being uncaused from nothing, but that things within space and time couldn't do that? I can't think of any germane feature of the universe that would make it plausible that the entire universe could just come into being uncaused.
Scott is saying that the principle of cause and effect is not a metaphysical one, meaning that it would be true outside of space and time or existing in all possible realities, but that is only limited to our physical reality, or at least that we only have evidence of it in our physical reality and we must remain agnostic about it beyond that. It seems like a very modest and humble position to take at first. The price tag is twofold. First, it seems to open up the door for the possibility that you can get something from absolute nothing, which means you can have the potential for something, which would be a something, and absolute nothing at the same time and in the same sense. This denies the law of non-contradiction, something I don't think anyone would be willing to give up. The second is that there is no reasonable explanation to deny the metaphysical reality of cause and effect. It is entirely ad hoc to do so. Now, forgive me for getting a little bit philosophical here, but I think it's very important to look at the objections and shed some light on the worldview price tag. It is easy to throw out an objection that casts doubt on a premise, but it is much harder to make sure that that objection doesn't have other detrimental implications to our worldview. In conclusion, I want to say two things. First is this: revisit when you first believed. Don't let other explanations crowd out your first conclusion that God was drawing you to himself. He constantly uses the things around us to draw us to him. And psychological or environmental reasons should not negate the explanation of God's involvement. Second, if you raise objections to the argument like the Kalam cosmological argument makes, you have to realize that the other worldview implications that might go along with it. Now let me know in the comments if you disagree or what reasons that you might have for believing God exists. And I look forward to meeting you next time as we deal with deconstruction.